True being followed horror stories in the quiet, misty town of Elmsfield, where the fog clings to the ground like a shroud and the trees whisper secrets on the wind. Locals share tales not just of being watched, but of being followed. These aren't tales of mere stalkers or earthly predators, but of something more sinister, more otherworldly. It was on a particularly dreary autumn evening when Anne, a young nurse returning from her late shift at the hospital, first felt it, a sensation of being observed, tracked by unseen eyes. Anne was no stranger to the eerie streets of Elmsfield, a town steeped in ghostly folklore, but this felt different. The air around her was colder, her park home dimly lit by the sparse street lamps that flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that danced around her. As she walked, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, a primal alert to danger she couldn't see but felt, deep in her bones. She quickened her pace, the clacking of her shoes on the cobblestone path echoing through the empty streets. Probably just my imagination, she muttered to herself, her voice a whisper lost in the swirling fog. Yet, the feeling persisted, a weight on her shoulders, a presence looming ever closer. At her doorstep, and fumbled with her keys, her fingers trembling. The usual night sounds of the town seemed muffled, as if the fog were a blanket smothering the world. Finally, inside, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart racing. She listened, the silence of her home offering no comfort, only oppressive solitude. That night, Anne's dreams were troubled, filled with shadowy figures and the sensation of endlessly running through thick, enveloping fog. She woke frequently, each time feeling as if something had just departed from her room. By morning, her nerves were frayed, the previous night's fears still clinging to her like the fog that hung outside her windows. The following night, Anne decided to take a different route home, through the town's old park, thinking the open spaces might alleviate her fears. But as she walked beneath the gnarled branches of ancient oaks, the sensation returned, more intense than before. This time, she heard whispers, carried on the wind, indistinct, yet unmistakably drawing closer. She broke into a run, her breath heavy, her steps urgent. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw nothing but the mist swirling violently as if agitated by her disturbance. Reaching the other side of the park, she dared to stop, her hands on her knees, catching her breath. That's when she saw them, footprints in the dew-soaked grass, barefoot, too large to be human, leading up to where she had stopped but not continuing on. Anne's mind raced. No local tale spoke of such phenomena. Elmsfield's legends were many, but none mentioned a creature that stalked its residents with such malevolence. For the next several days, Anne drove to work, avoiding the streets and the park. Yet, even within the presumed safety of her car, she felt it, a gaze that seemed to penetrate through the metal and glass, a darkness that followed her movements. The whispering became a constant undertone to her days, no longer confined to the night. Determined to seek answers, Anne visited the local library, poring over old newspapers and manuscripts, anything that might tell her what haunted the streets of Elmsfield. That's when she came across an old map of the town, dated back to the 1700s, with a section of the park marked as cursed ground. Intrigued and frightened, Anne dug deeper, discovering an account of a traveller from the 1800s who had spoken of a dark entity, a guardian of the land who preyed upon those who trespassed during the night. The article detailed various disappearances over the years, with locals whispering of a curse that the town had long forgotten. Fueled by a mix of fear and resolve, Anne decided to confront her stalker. That evening, equipped with only a flashlight and an old silver cross her grandmother had given her, she walked into the heart of the park, to the spot marked as cursed. The air grew colder as she approached, the fog thickening, swirling around her as if alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, no longer just whispers but voices chanting in a language she couldn't understand. Reaching the cursed ground, Anne felt a chill unlike any other, as if the very earth beneath her was alive with a malevolent force. She stood there, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but the dense fog and the gnarled trees. Then the air shifted, and the fog parted slightly, revealing a figure shrouded in darkness, its eyes like coals burning in the night. It moved toward her slowly, deliberately, as if each step was measured and full of purpose. The ground seemed to whisper under its weight, an eerie, mournful sound that matched the rhythm of Anne's racing heart. "You have come," it spoke, its voice a chilling blend of echoes, as if spoken through a veil of wind and shadows. "Why do you seek me?" Anne's hand tightened around the cross, her other hand clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. "I want to know why you follow me," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the fear that clenched her stomach. The figure halted a few feet away, the glow of its eyes intensifying. "You carry the mark," it said slowly, the air around it shimmering slightly as if distorted by heat. "The mark of the ancient ones. You belong to this land, more than you know." Confusion furrowed Anne's brow. "The mark? I don't understand. I'm not from here. I moved to Elmsfield only a few years ago." "The land does not heed the passage of time as mortals do," the figure responded. "It knows you as it knew your ancestors. You are bound to it, and it to you." A cold wind whipped through the park, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down Anne's spine. She felt a pull, a connection to the words being spoken, as if some deep, buried part of her recognized the truth in them. "What do you want from me?" Anne asked, struggling to keep her voice firm. "To reclaim what was promised," the entity said, moving closer. The fog seemed to curl around it, embracing it like an old friend. "A pact was made, long ago, binding your line to these grounds. You must fulfill it." And took a step back, her mind racing. "I don't know of any pact. Please, I just want to live my life in peace." The figure paused, tilting its head as if considering her words. "There can be no peace for those who are bound," it said finally. "Unless the debt is paid." Frozen by the creature's words, Anne felt the park around her grow darker, the shadows lengthening and merging into one another. She realized then that she wasn't merely being followed by some random spirit, but was caught in an ancient web of her family's making. "How do I pay this debt?" Anne asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "The offering must be made, here, under the blood moon, 3 nights from now," the figure instructed, its voice fading into the whispering wind. "Bring the heart of a stag, and bury it beneath the old oak. Only then will the pact be fulfilled, and your line freed." As quickly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the fog, leaving Anne alone with the chilling silence of the night. The air felt heavier, charged with a new purpose. She turned her flashlight off, the beam unnecessary now, her path illuminated by the eerie glow of the moon. Trembling, Anne walked back home, her mind a whirl of thoughts. She knew nothing of hunting, let alone taking the life of a creature as majestic as a stag. Yet, the alternative was a lifetime of haunting, of being chased by the deaths of the past. Over the next 2 days, Anne researched, her actions driven by a mixture of fear and an unexpected sense of duty to her ancestors. She learned to use a bow, practicing in the seclusion of her backyard, the task foreign but necessary. The night of the blood moon arrived, casting a crimson glow over Elmsfield. Armed with her bow and newly acquired skills, Anne set out for the forest, the weight of her family's legacy heavy on her shoulders. She tracked a stag through the underbrush, guided by the moonlight and an uncanny sense of where to find it. The forest seemed alive, aware of her purpose, whispering secrets through the leaves as she passed. Finally, she found the stag, a magnificent beast with antlers that seemed to reach towards the heavens. It stood majestically, bathed in the red light of the moon, its eyes meeting hers with an almost knowing sadness. Anne's heart ached as she raised her bow, the stag's gaze piercing through her. She hesitated, the bow trembling in her grasp. Could she really end this creature's life to satisfy an ancient pact? As she stood there, conflicted, the whispers of the forest grew louder, a crescendo that filled the night air with urgency. The stag remained still, as if offering itself, understanding its role in this age-old drama far better than she did. Drawing a deep breath, and steadied her bow, the decision made in her heart. The string twanged, the arrow flew, and the stag fell, its sacrifice a silent accord between the past and the present. Now, with the heart of the stag secured, and walked towards the old oak in the heart of the cursed ground. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sinister crimson light that seemed to bleed across the landscape. Her steps were heavy, burdened not only by the physical weight of her grim task, but also by the weight of centuries of history, now resting squarely on her shoulders. As she approached the tree, the air grew colder, the whispers louder, and the shadows deeper. The old oak stood towering and imposing, its gnarled branches twisting into the night like the fingers of a desperate spectre. And knelt at the base of the tree, her hands trembling as she began to dig into the earth. The ground was hard and cold, unyielding at first, as if resisting her intrusion. But she persevered, driven by the need to end her family's ancient curse, her movements becoming more frantic as the soil finally began to give way beneath her efforts. Once the hole was deep enough, and placed the heart of the stag within it, her hands slick with its blood, the metallic smell mixing with the earthy scent of the soil. She whispered a prayer she didn't fully understand, words that seemed to come to her from the wind itself, passed down through generations. As soon as the heart was buried, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and whipping around her as if the forest itself was reacting to the offering. The shadows around her seemed to pulsate, drawing in towards the oak tree, then expanding outwards rapidly, a visual echo of a heartbeat. And quickly filled the hole, her hands numb and her body shaking. As she patted down the last of the earth, the ground beneath her vibrated slightly, a gentle rumble that travelled up her spine. She stepped back, watching the oak tree warily, half expecting the ground to open up or the tree to bend down and take her into its ancient bark. But nothing happened, at least, nothing immediate. The wind died down, and the shadows settled, returning to their normal, less threatening forms. The night suddenly seemed quieter, the oppressive feeling of being watched or followed lifted like a fog at sunrise. For the first time in weeks, and felt alone, truly alone. She should have felt relief, but instead, a deep, unsettling unease settled into her bones. Had she done enough? Was the curse truly broken, or had she merely appeased whatever spirits or entities were tied to this land for now? With no clear answers and a heart heavy with both sorrow and fear, and walked back towards her home. The streets of Elmsfield were silent, the town sleeping unaware of the rituals performed on its behalf. The moon, still a haunting shade of red, watched her as she walked, its light casting long, lonely shadows across her path. As she reached her home, the familiar sight of it brought little comfort. The events of the night replayed in her mind, each detail sharp and vivid. The feeling of the stag's heart beating its last beat in her hands, the cold whisper of the wind as she buried it, the ominous silence that followed. Inside, and locked the door behind her and leaned against it, exhausted. She slid down to the floor, her back against the wood, and let out a long, shuddering breath. Their house was silent, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of anticipation, of waiting. As she sat there, trying to gather the strength to stand and make her way to bed, a small sound caught her attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, the sound of something brushing against a window, a gentle tap, tap, tap that seemed to rhythm with her own heartbeat. Anne's eyes snapped to the window, her breath catching in her throat. In the moonlight, she could see it, a shadow, or perhaps more than a shadow, lingering just outside the glass. As she watched, frozen with a mix of fear and disbelief, the tapping continued, persistent, insistent. Not yet, she whispered to herself, or perhaps to whatever waited outside. It's not done yet. The tapping stopped, as if in acknowledgement of her realization, and a cold dread settled over Anne. The night's work was not over, perhaps it was only just beginning. As she stood, her resolve hardened. Whatever this curse demanded, whatever this town hid in its fog and shadows, she would face it. She had to. The clock in the hall struck 3, the chimes echoing through the silent house like a warning. The witching hour was here, and with it, the true test of Anne's courage and her family's legacy. Anne stood and moved towards the window, her movements slow and deliberate. As she pulled back the curtain, the shadow outside moved, as if beckoning. She opened the window, the night air cold and sharp against her skin. "Show yourself," Anne said, her voice steady but low. "I'm not done with you yet." Outside, the moonlight shimmered through the leaves, casting a surreal glow over the garden. Anne's eyes scanned the darkness, searching for the source of the tapping. Silence hung heavily in the air, the sort of silence that presses against the ears and raises the hair on the back of the neck. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the moonlight. It was not the dark entity from the park, but rather a childlike form, pale and translucent, almost glowing against the darkness of the night. It stared at him with eyes too large for its small face, eyes that seemed to hold an eternity of sadness. "Who are you?" Anne asked, her voice a mix of fear and compassion. "I am what remains," the figure whispered, its voice a haunting echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I am what was left behind when the pact was made." Anne's heart ached at the sight of the childlike apparition. What pact? What was left behind? "The pact of your ancestors," the figure replied. "They sought to protect this land, to bind the darkness that roamed free. But in doing so, they sacrificed more than they knew. They bound me, a guardian of this land, and in my binding, they lost their way." A cold breeze swept through the open window, carrying with it the scents of the forest and something else, something ancient and forgotten. "What do you want from me?" Anne asked, her voice steady despite the chill that crept into her bones. "Release," the figure said simply. "Release me, and set right what was wronged." "How?" Anne's mind raced, thinking of the ritual she had performed, wondering if it had been enough. "The heart of the stag was but the first step," the figure explained, moving closer to the window, its form becoming more defined, less ethereal. "You must complete the circle, bring back the balance that was lost." And felt overwhelmed by the revelation. How do I complete the circle? How do I bring back the balance? The figure pointed to the ground, to the very earth that Elm's Field was built upon. "Return to the old oak, where you buried the heart. There you will find the stone of binding. It must be returned to the heart of the forest, to the place where the first pact was made. But I don't know where that is." And protested, the task seeming impossible. "I will guide you," the figure promised, its voice becoming softer, almost comforting. "But you must hurry. The balance shifts, and the darkness grows stronger with each passing night." And nodded, understanding the urgency. "I will do it," she said, determination stealing her resolve. The figure smiled, a sad, wistful expression that tugged at Anne's heart. "Be brave, child of the pact. Your journey is not yet over." With those final words, the apparition faded into the night, leaving Anne alone once again. She closed the window slowly, her mind heavy with the weight of her newfound responsibilities. The next morning, Anne prepared for her journey into the heart of the forest. She packed supplies, not knowing how long she might be gone, and gathered old maps that might help her find the place the apparition had spoken of. Her heart was heavy, but her spirit was resolute. She would complete the circle and restore the balance, no matter the cost. As she set out from her home, the town of Elm's Field seemed different to her now. The streets were quiet, the fog still hung low, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if the town itself knew the significance of her journey. The forest loomed ahead, dark and inviting, the trees whispering secrets on the wind. Anne stepped into the shadows, the map clutched tightly in her hand, guided by the spirit of the childlike guardian. The path was unclear, obscured by overgrowth and the passage of time, but pushed forward, driven by a force greater than fear. Hours turned into days as she ventured deeper into the forest, her surroundings growing wilder, more untamed. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay, the ground soft and damp beneath her feet. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, always just out of sight, reminding her that she was not alone. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of wandering, and came upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone, covered in moss and vines, its surface carved with symbols that glowed faintly in the twilight. This was the heart of the forest, the place where the first pact was made, and where she would complete the circle. Anne approached the stone, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the cold, rough surface. The symbols pulsed under her fingers, a warm light spreading out from the stone, illuminating the clearing in a soft, ethereal glow. The light from the stone grew, casting eerie shadows that danced on the trees surrounding the clearing. The air became charged, the atmosphere thick with anticipation and ancient power. Anne could feel the energy coursing through her veins, a connection to the land and its history that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She took a deep breath, centering herself before the task at hand. Placing both hands firmly on the stone, she closed her eyes and whispered the words the apparition had taught her, words that seemed to echo through the ages, resonating with the stone and the forest around her. As she spoke, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a soft vibration at first that grew stronger with each word she uttered. The wind picked up, howling through the trees with a ferocity that matched the rising tumult within the clearing. Leaves and branches swirled around her, caught in a vortex of supernatural force that centered on the stone. And continued to chant, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The symbols on the stone glowed brighter, a blazing blue that lit the entire clearing with an otherworldly light. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment, the boundary between the physical and the ethereal seemed to blur, the forest around her coming alive with whispered voices and fleeting shadows. Suddenly, from the depths of the forest, a dark figure emerged. It moved towards and with an unnatural grace, its form both fluid and shadowy, a manifestation of the darkness that had been stirred by her ritual. Anne could feel its malevolence, a palpable hatred that chilled her to the bone. But she did not falter. With a final, forceful utterance, she completed the chant, pushing all of her willpower into the stone. The ground shook violently, a deep grumble that threatened to knock her off her feet. The dark figure halted, its form wavering as if pained by the light emanating from the stone. The wind screamed around her, and the forest seemed to bend towards the clearing, drawn by the power she had unleashed. Anne opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the dark figure as it struggled against the light. With a defiant cry, she pushed further, her hands burning against the cold stone. The figure let out a wail, a sound so mournful and desperate that it momentarily drowned out the wind. Then, with a sudden burst of light so intense it blinded her, the figure disintegrated, dissolving into a cloud of shadow that was quickly swept away by the wind. Silence fell over the clearing, the light from the stone fading to a soft glow. Anne staggered back, exhausted and breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it, she had restored the balance, completed the circle her ancestors had begun. As she regained her breath, the forest around her seemed to settle, the natural sounds of night returning. The stone before her stood silent and dark once more, its purpose fulfilled. Anne felt a deep, resonant peace settle over the clearing, a sense of rightness that permeated the air. She turned to leave, her body weary but her spirit uplifted. As she walked back through the forest, the trees seemed to whisper their thanks, their leaves brushing against her as if in a gentle caress. But as she neared the edge of the forest, a faint sound caught her attention, a sound that seemed out of place in the calm of the night. It was a soft, dragging step, repeated over and over, coming from just beyond the tree line. And paused, her newly found peace giving way to a creeping dread. She turned slowly, peering into the dark forest. There, in the shadows between the trees, she could just make out a figure, its form too indistinct to identify, but unmistakably there. The realization hit her with a cold shock. The forest was old, its secrets many. The curse might have been lifted, but the land still held mysteries, some perhaps darker and more enduring than any curse. As the figure in the shadows moved closer, its movements deliberate and unhurried, and knew her journey was far from over. With a deep breath, she readied herself for what was to come, the forest whispering around her, a mixture of warning and welcome. And stood frozen, her eyes straining to make out the details of the approaching figure. The trees seemed to hold their breath along with her, the usual night sounds eerily absent. The figure's movements were slow, almost cautious, as if it was unsure of its welcome. As it stepped into a patch of moonlight and caught her breath, the figure was no ghost or malevolent entity but a man, old and bent, his face lined with years of secrets and sorrow. His eyes, deeply set beneath bushy brows, held a sadness that spoke of lifetimes of regret. "Who are you?" Anne's voice barely rose above a whisper, her body tense, ready to flee or fight. The old man stopped a few feet away, his gaze penetrating. "I'm the keeper of this land, or I was, until you freed me," he said, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to blend with the rustling leaves. "Keeper?" Anne's confusion deepened. "I don't understand. I thought I ended the curse, restored the balance." "You did," the old man nodded slowly. "And in doing so, you freed me from my bondage to the darkness that consumed this place. But with every end comes a new beginning, a new duty." "What duty?" Anne asked, a sinking feeling in her stomach. "To watch over the land, to ensure the balance is maintained. The darkness you dispelled was old and deep, tied to the very soil of this forest. It will seek to return, as all things banished you." The old man's eyes held hers, unblinking, like pools of shadow. And felt the weight of his words settle over her like a cloak. "You mean, I have to stay here? Become like you?" "Not like me," the old man corrected gently. "You will have your freedom, unlike I did. But yes, you must watch, protect. It is the role passed down through your bloodline, now awakened by your actions." Anne's mind reeled. This was more than she had bargained for when she set out to lift a curse. She thought of her life before, of the simplicity of her days, now lost to this strange, new responsibility. "How long?" she asked, her voice small. "For as long as the land needs you," he replied. "Until another comes to take your place, as you did for me." The old man stepped closer, extending a gnarled hand. "Come, let me show you what you need to know." Reluctantly, Anne took his hand, his grip surprisingly strong. He led her back to the stone, now dark and cold in the moonlight. He explained how the energies of the land converged here, how the stone served as a focus for the forest's life force. "You must feel the land, understand its whispers, its cries. You will know when the darkness returns, and you must act swiftly to counter it," he instructed, his voice gaining strength as he spoke of his former duties. They spent the rest of the night walking the forest paths, the old man showing Anne the hidden places, the sacred spots where the earth's energy was strongest. As dawn approached, a sense of calm settled over Anne. This was her destiny, intertwined with the land she had come to love, even in its darkest moments. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, the old man stopped. "I must go now," he said, turning to face her. "My time here is done." "Will I see you again?" Anne asked, a sudden fear of loneliness gripping her heart. "Perhaps, in time," he said, smiling. "But I leave you in good hands. The forest will speak to you now, as it did to me." With that, he stepped back, his form beginning to fade like mist in the morning sun. "Remember, keep the balance," were his last words before he disappeared completely. And stood alone in the clearing, the weight of her new role settling around her shoulders. she felt a whisper of wind brush her cheek, a sigh through the leaves. The forest was speaking to her, its new guardian. And so, and began her vigil, the keeper of the balance, watching, waiting, protecting. The land was part of her now, and she was part of it, a pact sealed by blood and spirit. The darkness might return, but she would be ready, the guardian of Elmsfield and all its hidden secrets. As the sun rose higher, casting light on the paths of the forest, and knew this was only the beginning. The true test of her courage and her commitment lay ahead. But for now, she had found her place in the world, not just in Elmsfield, but as a part of the living, breathing entity that was the land itself. And with that knowledge, she stepped forward into her new life, ready for whatever challenges it might bring, forever linked to the cycles and secrets of the ancient forest. As days turned into weeks and grew into her role, her senses sharpening to the whispers and warnings of the land. She learned to read the signs, the way the birds sang warnings on the wind, how the trees swayed to tell of coming storms, or the uneasy silence that fell before something darker approached. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the dense trees, and felt a disturbance, a ripple of unease that flowed through the ground and into her bones. She grabbed her lantern and followed the sensation deep into the heart of the forest, to a forgotten glade she hadn't visited before. In the center of the glade stood an ancient stone altar, long unused, vines creeping over its sides, obscuring ancient runes. The disturbance centered here, a pulsing undercurrent that seemed almost like breathing. An approach cautiously, lantern held high, throwing light on the stone that seemed to absorb it hungrily. The air grew colder, her breath forming mist as she read the runes, her fingers tracing their ancient grooves. The words spoke of a binding, a seal on something ancient and forgotten, something that was now stirring as the seal weakened. And realized the responsibility her predecessor had mentioned was not just to protect from external darkness, but also to keep what was already trapped from escaping. The realization was a heavy weight, but also a clarifying moment. This was her purpose, this was why her bloodline was tied to this land. She knew what needed to be done. Returning to her home, she gathered the old books the previous keeper had left her, books of rituals and old magic, potent with the knowledge of generations. Armed with this ancient wisdom, she returned to the glade under the light of the full moon, prepared to renew the seal. The ritual was long and demanding, requiring every ounce of her focus and strength. She drew protective circles, lit candles at cardinal points, and chanted incantations that echoed through the night, blending with the natural sounds of the forest. The ground vibrated, the altar glowing with a pale light as the seal strengthened, the darkness pushing back, fighting against its bonds. As dawn approached, Anne's final chant echoed across the glade, a powerful command that sealed the binding. Exhausted, she collapsed, the first rays of sunlight breaking over the horizon, casting light on her prone form. When she awoke, the forest was peaceful, the disturbance quelled. The altar's glow had faded, and the runes were once again just grooves in the stone. Anne stood, feeling a sense of accomplishment, but also a profound connection to the land. She was its keeper, truly now, not just in name but in deed. She returned to her cottage, the forest seeming to nod in approval of her actions. The trees whispered not just warnings now, but also thanks. And knew this peace might not last forever, the darkness could rise again, perhaps in new forms. But she also knew she was ready, capable of facing whatever came from the shadows. As she sat by her window, looking out over the land she was sworn to protect, and felt a deep, unshakable peace. She was where she was meant to be, doing what she was born to do. The forest outside was alive, a part of her now, its whispers her guidance, its needs her duty. In Elmsfield, the story of Anne, the keeper of the forest, became a new legend, whispered among the townspeople with a mix of awe and gratitude. They spoke of her as the guardian of their peace, the watcher of the woods, the one who walked the paths at night, ensuring that the darkness stayed where it belonged, locked beneath the ancient stone in the heart of the forest, watched over by a force as old and as enduring as the land itself. And so, life went on, under the protective gaze of Anne, the last in a long line of guardians, a bridge between the human and the mystical, forever bound to the heartbeat of the ancient, whispering woods.